Welcome to this episode of Religion and American Life, a podcast by the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. My name is Mark Massa. I'm a Jesuit here at Boston College and the director of the Blasey Center, and today's podcast host. This podcast is an initiative of the Blasey Center's commitment to connecting a community of scholars, policymakers, media, and religious leaders in conversation and scholarly reflection around issues at the intersection of religion and American public life. And today, we have a star. Today, we are joined by Dr. Susannah Heschel to discuss anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism, among other things, in the United States. Dr. Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is a big German phrase that means she studies Judaism and Jewish faith scientifically and academically. And she has used feminist, postcolonial, and critical race theoretical models in interpreting Jewish-Christian relations. She is the author of many books, and she is also the recipient of 5 honorary doctorates from institutions in the United States, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland. She has held research grants for the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. I want credit for this, Susannah, because I failed my German exam in graduate school. Welcome, Susannah Heschel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Mark. And I look forward to our discussion.
So, Susannah, I want to start by saying, since the Gaza war began a while back now, I guess my first question to you has that war and the American reactions to that war, especially reactions to caused by college campus sit-ins and various things, has that given rise to a new anti-Semitism in the United States? And if it is, if it is a new anti-Semitism, how is it different from the older variety?
So that's a big question, and most likely it will take some distance for historians to evaluate what has actually transpired in the last 2 years since October 7th. I think what, first of all, was striking was simply the attack of October 7th. The 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered, and also some who were not Israeli citizens from Thailand, for example. And in addition, 250 were taken hostage. The crimes that were committed that day, the slaughter was horrific. Babies and the elderly who were also taken hostage and killed while in hostage, really slaughtered, and sexual violence as well. So that was something shocking to a lot of Jews, because that kind of slaughter, the kind of attack, had not happened since 1945, since the Holocaust. So it was a shock. And it was a shock also because the whole point of Zionism was to have a place where Jews would be safe from violence. So that is a trauma that I think will be long lasting for a full generation or two, certainly. Now, what happened the next day was equally shocking, I would say. There was a rally held in New York, and a former colleague of mine, a professor who's now at another university, spoke at a rally and said that he felt exhilarated by the attack on October 7th. And I was struck by the use of the word exhilarated, and I've heard that more than once. Why would an attack like that be exhilarating? 1,200 people were just killed. And even if you don't know them and it's in another part of the world, let's say we hear about a tsunami, an earthquake, and masses of people are killed, we feel sad. We don't feel exhilarated. So where does that word come from? What does that represent? Now, I would say, first of all, that to be exhilarated over the death of hundreds of 1,200 people, to be exhilarated is something sadistic about that. I don't take pleasure when others have been killed. For whatever reason, under whatever circumstances, it shouldn't give me pleasure. So there was something sadistic about the reaction. Now, I would say it wasn't sadistic just because of this attack, but because we're living in a moment in America of cultural sadism. That's my opinion. And this was simply an expression of it. And that's a big worry that we should have at our forefront right now. What is this sadistic culture that's so pervasive?
Well, let me stop you right there because I can see you, as is typical with you, you're quite brilliantly lay out a whole landscape here. So before we go further into landscape, to what extent is current, the current status of anti-Semitism, to what extent is that, if there is a new anti-Semitism right now, to what extent is that the result of our current political landscape, which is significantly different than it was 2 years ago, much different than it was, say, 10 years ago? So to what extent are we talking about a function of the terrifyingly divisive political landscape that is the United States today? And how does that feature into that anti-Semitism?
The landscape is very different. And I would say it's not simply that we're polarized, which everybody recognizes, but rather I would say that both ends of the spectrum, of this political spectrum, are mirror images of each other. That is the radical left, the radical right. They're the same. They're the same in one way, not with specific policies necessarily, but certainly with the mood, with the atmosphere, with the political strategies that they employ. And that's what's giving rise to the pervasive sadistic culture, because it's coming from both ends of the spectrum. And the anti-Semitism is also coming from both ends of the spectrum. So, for example, the exhilaration that people were expressing after October 7th, what does that mean? Essentially, it means Israel got what it deserved. Now, who talks like that? There were people that were, in fact, distinguished feminist theorists. Feminists say always, believe the women, rape is rape, it's terrible. But they said in this case, the rape of Israeli women by Hamas was resistance, not rape, resistance. Now, for a feminist to do that is essentially to completely repudiate everything that feminism stands for. But rape is never resistance, and murder is not resistance, and it should not arouse in us a sense of exhilaration. Tragedy, worry, horror, despair, that I understand. So the anti-Semitism is appearing at this moment at both ends of the political spectrum, left wing, right wing, and in a pervasive culture that is sadistic and that is blaming victims for their own victimization. Now, I'm not saying that nothing Israel has ever done is bad, but you don't murder people, civilians, as a political act. That's the problem.
I understand exactly what you're saying. How is that complicated Jewish response to this stuff? I mean, how is that the fact that both ends of the spectrum are now sort of engaging in anti-Semitic kind of rhetoric for different reasons? How does that complicate the response?
So you're asking a very difficult question. There's much one can say about it, and I want to be a bit cautious in my response. I would say, first of all, we're dealing with different kinds of groups here that are not equivalent one with the other. So when a sovereign state is attacked, of course it responds. Of course it does. All sovereign states do that. And Hamas knew perfectly well that by launching this attack, Israel would retaliate. That's clear. Now, Hamas presents itself as some ruling party, let's say, that was elected in 2006 in Gaza, after which it stopped all possible future elections. So that's it. But Hamas, we can see, is not a sovereign state, and it's not concerned about the well-being of its own people, that is, the Gazans, or it wouldn't have launched this attack knowing that there would be retaliation. So let's consider what is the ideology going on in both sides. Now, the two sides can't be compared in that sense. I also understand that what has taken place is, of course, the result of decades and decades of a long-standing conflict that is yet to be resolved. The question then would be, why hasn't it been resolved? Whose interests are being served by not resolving it? What is being prevented here by avoiding a legitimate peace? What is really the heart of the conflict? And perhaps we need to talk about that.
So, would you want to unpack that, what you just finished saying there? Why do you think it's not been resolved? And do you think that we are any nearer to a resolution given the UN Security Council's recent vote?
So I'm not a scholar of this particular field, and I'm not in the field of political science. But what I do understand from colleagues and books I've read and classes and so forth is that people have a vested interest in keeping the conflict going. Who has a vested interest? I would say the West and the East, around the world, so to speak. So speaking for the suffering of Palestinians has become a way of certain states distracting their own people from their own poverty and the own corruption of their own government and so forth. So there are ways in which the conflict has served the interests of other countries, and that includes Arab countries. It also includes certain political interests, including left-wing political interests that want to have, in fact, a major conflagration, because out of the revolution, some kind of perfect socialist state will emerge in their fantasy. And on the right, there are also interests that want to keep the conflict going, because in this way, we will have a so-called, the West will have a foot in the door in the Middle East, an excuse to have arms and military position there, and also to take advantage of the natural resources that we exploit, of course. There are financial interests in any conflict, those who manufacture weapons, for example, among others, yeah? So without a war, what would our whole manufacturing industry in the United States look like, let alone in Europe and China and so forth? So we have to understand that the conflict is not just between Israel and Palestine. And then I would just make one other point. We established a United Nations, and the United Nations is supposed to be a legitimate representative organization that seeks peace in the world. 1947, the United Nations member countries voted to partition. They voted to establish basically a Jewish state. They wanted to have also a Palestinian state, but they wanted a Jewish state. That launched then a war. Now, I won't go into the details of that, but just to say, when the United Nations comes to a resolution that says we want to make a partition, we accept a Jewish state, you can't go back on that. The world can't step away and say, oh, we made a mistake. It doesn't work like that. I would actually quote Cardinal Bea, Augustine Cardinal Bea, who steered the Nostra Aetate document produced by the Second Vatican Council, and who spoke in theological terms and said, God does not change his mind and revoke the covenant that he established with Israel that is recorded in the Old Testament. And so too, the nations of the world cannot revoke an international decision made at the United Nations. So the existence of Israel is simply a fact that people have to accept, and now we have to move forward with that. I personally, as you know, think it would be the greatest fantastic miracle and wonder for the whole world to have a state of Israel and a state of Palestine, to be able to take a train from Tel Aviv up to Damascus and then across to Beirut, or drive your car there and so on. And I actually believe that that will happen one day, and that we will have neighboring countries at peace with each other, collaborating, cooperating, and making their lives better, because they each have something important to contribute.
I hope our hearers understood. I asked Susannah an unfair big question. She quite brilliantly laid out various possible ways of understanding this. It sounds easy. It's not easy. That's why she's so smart. So I want to return to the question I started with. So as the result of all this, we're further down the road. So has the conflict and the current attempt to resolve conflict and the perceptions of that conflict, has it given rise to a new kind of anti-Semitism from, say, 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
It's hard to say if the anti-Semitism is new, because in some sense, for 2,000 years, it hasn't been new. It's been revived and refreshed. It's like a reservoir that's always available. And if you turn on the tap, there it is. So I would say the ideas of it are not new. What's taken everybody aback is that it's happening in the United States. The assumption has always been that when you live in a multicultural democracy, we don't have such things. Now, that's a naive assumption, because the United States has had plenty of racism and anti-Semitism and hatred toward Catholics and toward Hispanics and Europeans and so on. So we shouldn't be naive when we say, how can it happen in America that there would be anti-Semitism? Well, I can understand it, especially at a moment when people are questioning democracy, immigration, multiculturalism, the foundations of our country, and actually questioning whether we should have, as we do, a judicial system, a Congress, and an executive branch, 3 branches of government. All of these things are coming into question. So in a way, it's not surprising. And it's not surprising that we are rounding up people on the streets of this country and expelling them, some of whom are legal status, have citizenship in this country, and are simply trying to make a better life, and are helping us tremendously, actually, with our economy.
Right. So the thing that struck me, and you and I have talked about this several times, what is new from my point of view is the violence in the United States, the violence against synagogues and against Jewish people. I mean, I agree with you. There's always been an anti-Semitic strain. It's an old strain and a strong strain in American culture. But the thing that really shocked me is the violence, the attacks, the physical attacks on Jews and the physical attacks on Jewish spaces. That's something that shocked me, and I presume shocked the Jewish community in the United States as well.
I agree with you. That is shocking. The physical violence, Jews walking down the street and being attacked, and synagogues being attacked. Of course, we also realize that churches have also been attacked in the United States, Black churches in particular. 10% of the bombings in the South during the Civil Rights era, by the way, were synagogues or Jewish-affiliated institutions. So it is, again, it is shocking. It is horrible. And at the same time, I don't want us to be too shocked, because I think that makes, I think we need to face up to our history.
The physicality of some of the recent anti-Semitism, has that changed Jewish responses to the Middle East crisis, or has it changed their perception of their fit within American culture generally?
Yes, I think Jews have always felt that America was the safe place, and now they don't. And the question is, if you're not safe in America, where can you be safe? And of course, we're also aware that the situation for Jews in certain European countries is even worse. And since October 7th attack in Israel, there's a sense that you're not safe in Israel either. So these are all concerns, and Jews are worried. At the same time, Jews don't really know what to do about it. And I would say there are many, many, many Jewish organizations that exist in order to counter anti-Semitism, such as the Anti-Defamation League. And that's one of many. And yet, what they tend to be doing is warning us and telling us this is anti-Semitic and look at this, what this happened, and so on. They don't give us advice. What should we do?
There also seems to be an internal debate about what anti-Semitism is. In other words, is any criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? Is anything that's critical of Israel, the state of Israel's policy toward others, is that any questioning of that, is that anti-Semitism? And I know within the Jewish, I have many Jewish friends here at Boston College. I know that within the Jewish community itself, there's this debate going on about what anti-Semitism is and how best to counter it.
Yes, and I would just suggest another dimension. That sometimes it's not what people say, but how they say it. And I also think that there are times when someone will make a comment that's not nice, but then we make a response to it. So I remember my mother told me when she was a little girl, she was the only Jew in her school, a public school in Cleveland. And they were waiting on line, all the second graders, 7 years old. And a girl came over to her and said, "Go to the back of the line, you Jew." And my mother's little friend said, "Jesus was a Jew. You stay right here." Now, do we classify that as an anti-Semitic moment or as a moment of actual, I don't know what to call it, beautiful affirmation? Such things can happen. I can have a student come to my office and tell me that he or she doesn't know if Israel should exist and it doesn't have the right to it and so on. And I will then respond and talk to the student and suggest articles and books to read and arguments that have been made and so on. I don't think that student is being anti-Semitic. Now, if somebody comes and screams in my face, you horrible Jew, or you horrible Israel, something, that's a different thing. So we have to consider the circumstances and the tone of voice and what's really going on beneath the surface. This is really someone who hates me or is repeating something obnoxious that he heard. And, it's a 19-year-old student. What do they know? They're kids still. And they like to be radical.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this has happened to you because you and I have talked about this many times, both when you're teaching at Harvard and you're teaching at Dartmouth. When a Jewish person is presented with something that could conceivably be understood as anti-Semitic, and you sort of started outlining this already in your last remark. What's the best way of turning it around, like the little girl said to your mother when she was 7 years old? Like, what's the best way of sort of dealing with that situation and maybe making it into a moment of grace as opposed to a moment of hate?
I have had such experiences. I'll tell you, I once was at a weekend Jewish Christian gathering. It was in East Berlin, and it was very intense. And the people there over the 2 days were not friendly to Jews. They actually were pretty angry about Israel because it was a communist country and so on. So it was tense. And then it was supposed to conclude on Saturday night. And I asked the organizers, what did you plan for the conclusion? Well, they hadn't planned anything. And I said, well, you have to do something. I have to have some prayer to conclude. So they said, okay, we'll read the Lord. We'll all recite the Lord's Prayer. And I said, no. This is Jewish Christian. That's a Christian prayer. And so they said, okay, we'll read a psalm. You read it in Hebrew, we'll read it in German. Fine. So I read it in Hebrew, and my colleague, Protestant pastor Rainer Graupner, read it in German. But there was a mood in the room as if somehow they weren't ready yet to leave. So I whispered to him, why don't you say the Lord's Prayer now? And he was startled, and he said, really? And he told the audience, that he had proposed it. I had said no, and now I'm telling them to recite it. And so everybody stood up and began reciting the Lord's Prayer in German. But there was something about the configuration at that moment where I was now giving permission for them to recite this great prayer from Jesus. And when they came to the line, and forgive us our sins, people started crying. It touched them because prayer can transform human beings. Prayer comes out of the soul, and it can say to your mind and your mental arguments, just a minute, put that aside, open your heart. And so there people stood and they were weeping, and they suddenly understood, yes, in fact, Germany had committed a great crime against the Jews, and they were willing to feel it. It wasn't a matter of debate. They felt it, and they felt sorry. They felt the tragedy. So I do believe very strongly that prayer has that ability. And it's not just that it transformed them. I just want to say also, it touched them because it was something that they couldn't express until that moment. Because some things cannot be put into words, into an argument. And prayer allows us to express wishes or fantasies or hopes or longings, yearnings, and things that might, in fact, even be embarrassing to say in words. So yes, there are certainly ways to transform.
That's really interesting. So, as you know, I've written a couple books ago. I wrote a book called Anti-Catholicism in America, which Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the oldest acceptable prejudice. I'm not sure that's true, but I'm just quoting Arthur Schlesinger here. And my sense is that anti-Catholicism was caused by many things, by the sheer numbers of Irish immigrants, by their place in the socioeconomic ladder, by all kinds of things. But one of the things that gave rise to a fierce anti-Catholicism in the mid-19th century was a sense of having dual allegiance, that the Catholics were Americans, but not really, because they were also loyal to the Pope, who was a foreign potentate, a foreign government in Rome, and therefore they couldn't give single pure allegiance to the United States alone. And that dual allegiance was the cause of much anti-Catholicism. Do you think that that applies as well to anti-Semitism and Jews' relationship to the state of Israel?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say I think there is a sense of dual allegiance, but it's expressed differently. So anti-Catholicism says, well, you're just loyal to the Vatican. Yeah, and that came up with the campaign of John F. Kennedy, of course. With Jews, the predominant motif these days seems to be what is derived from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. That is, Jews have a cabal that's controlling the world. The Jews are controlling Congress, controlling the president, controlling US foreign policy, et cetera, and that the US is not acting in its own best interests, it's acting under pressure from Jews, that kind of argument. But of course, underlying that is dual loyalty in the sense that Jews only care about Jewish interests and don't care about the rest of the world. And that's crazy, that's nonsense. So it's the same, in that sense, the same irrational idea that underlies anti-Catholicism.
Yeah. And do you think what's the best way of addressing when someone raises a question that seems to imply part of their question is the dual loyalty of Jews to Israel? I mean, I have my set answer about Catholics, but what would you say is a good answer in terms of somebody who raises the questions about American Jews' allegiance to Israel?
What do you say
I would say Catholics have a purely spiritual allegiance to the Bishop of Rome. And if you know any Catholics, you know a lot of Catholics have a very bad opinion of the Bishop of Rome. So, I mean, it's a strong emotion, but not always a positive one. So, it's more complicated than you understand. And that, this is an allegiance that's been worked out over centuries. But it has nothing to do with national priorities, has nothing to do with the interests of the United States. It has nothing to do with how American Catholics have to respect the consciences and rights of non-Catholics in their midst. So it's a completely different kind of loyalty than, say, standing up and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. That's my answer. So.
That's interesting. That's great. And I would say, first of all, that there's a lot of conflict among Jews in the United States, Europe, around the world, and in Israel itself toward the Israeli government. And as you know, huge protests against the government. Many Israelis are furious with what the current government has been doing over many issues. And the fury comes from all ends of the political spectrum, by the way, from the left and the right. I would say there is a relationship between the United States' own political and economic interests and the state of Israel that is very deep and very important. And it's not entirely negative. I would say for those who want to turn their backs on Israel or boycott Israel, if you want to boycott Israel, you're going to have to give up your phone, your iPhone and your computer and your generic medication that's produced by the Teva company and so on. There are contributions that are being made by scientists and intellectuals, et cetera, in Israel that we all benefit from. So I don't know what the word loyalty would mean in that context. I am certainly loyal to my family. And if there is a drug that will cure my child from a disease, that comes first. So that the way the question is formulated about dual loyalty, that's the problem.
Right.
We all have loyalties, multiple loyalties, and we should, without question.
We have many loyalties, and we rank them in our heads. So to imply that anti-Semitism or anti-Catholicism is different because it's a dual loyalty would seem to imply that other people don't have multiple loyalties as well, which they do, and they don't even think about. Both Judaism and Christianity makes it very clear that the core of both Judaism and Christianity is that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. The Pentateuch, the Torah says that. Jesus says that in the New Testament. So what happened in the Middle East happened on October the 7th. The sheer slaughter that resulted horrified people everywhere. And I think they horrified believing Christians and Jews because of the violence that strikes at the very heart of Judaism and Christianity. Do you want to address that?
The slaughter by Hamas of Israelis was a nightmare, but so are the deaths in Gaza of innocent civilians and the suffering, the destruction of homes, of schools, of hospitals, of universities. I think also Gaza was our world's responsibility for a long time, and we didn't step up. The situation was a nightmare. Israel was unprepared. The army was unprepared. There was no security. It took such a long time for the Israelis to mobilize themselves when the attack began. It went on for hours and hours, 1,200 people killed. And where was the army? So that was a disaster. And it's also a disaster that the person who was in charge of all of this, namely the prime minister, is still in office. I would expect that someone who bears that kind of responsibility of utter incompetence would be forced out. So I don't understand how that's possible. The prime minister, Netanyahu, has more Jewish blood on his hands than any other Jew in history. It's a nightmare. And then, of course, the response was war against Hamas. How do you wage a war against a terrorist organization that has built massive tunnels in which to hide and launch strikes? And they were sending missiles and rockets into Israel and so forth. So what do you do? And so the result was the Israeli army launched airstrikes that just blanketed Gaza. And in the process of trying to kill the Hamas fighters, they ended up killing thousands and thousands of innocent civilians, men, women, children, babies, old people, destroying schools and hospitals. And they still haven't actually destroyed all of the tunnels in Gaza that were built, massive tunnels. And another question is, why did they know what was going on all these years? Tunnels are not built overnight. So there's another element here, which is the element of shame. The shame that the Israeli army feels for its absolute absence on October 7th, the shame that they didn't know what was going on all these years, etc. And shame is a powerful emotion for an individual and for a country. And what do you do with shame? You get enraged to try to suppress that feeling. It's too awful. So you scream at yourself to try to distract. So the army initially was targeting Hamas fighters effectively, but after a while, it turned into a massive war, in part motivated by vengeance. And while I know this is how countries respond, sovereign state, it was horrible. It was a nightmare. It is a nightmare. And these poor people in Gaza who have survived it somehow, where are they to live? Where are their homes destroyed? And let's think, not in addition to everything else, I also want to just point out that when you bomb apartment buildings and they collapse, remember what happened with the World Trade Center. Those buildings emitted a horrific chemicals, substances into the air that gave people cancer. So the destruction of Gaza has also unleashed chemicals into the air, the buildings themselves. And those chemicals float around in the air, and they're going to affect everybody in the region, including Israelis. So it's a nightmare that is beyond comprehension at times when you think about the proportions of it.
This is the central role of all religions. How does one address violence? How does one respond to violence in a way that's not itself violent and accusatory?
That's a great question, and it's the key question. How does peace succeed against rage and violence? What does one do? And we search We search for that. We search for an answer to that question. I don't think we've found it yet. But perhaps we can make this moment of this horrific war, perhaps we can make into a moment where we begin to talk about really how to change the way we proceed in this world. That maybe we can use this moment to create a real peace between Israel and Palestine. And I do think some European countries are moving in that direction. I also, it seems to me, I can tell you that in Lebanon, where I have a good friend, colleague, people are grateful that Hezbollah hasn't been entirely destroyed, but it's been in many ways dismantled and taken out of the government. And they have a new prime minister and president who are anti-corruption. And there's a lot of hope now in Lebanon, in part thanks to Israel retaliating against Hezbollah's attacks. Syria also, and I'm visiting Damascus next month, by the way, with a small group. Syria also seems to be interested in negotiations with Israel. And so what may emerge may be something very good. And I suppose we should keep that hope at the forefront right now as religious people.
So thanks to Dr. Susannah Heschel and her wonderful reflections on the current situation, both in the United States and the Middle East. Please join us next time for another podcast from the Blasey Center.
Thank you for listening to Religion and American Life, a podcast by the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. For more information on the work of the Blasey Center, the Center's schedule of events, or to listen to other episodes of this podcast, please visit our website at bc.edu/BOISI.